EA's Godfather game from the mid-2000s is a fabulous title, one of my favourite licensed games, and something I'll be making a video on very soon. But there's something else related to the classic series that I want to look at first. A lot of people thought that making a game based on a film as revered as The Godfather was a ballsy thing to do back when EA's title was announced, but, well, they must have forgotten about the time that a Godfather game was released back in 1991. Or likelier they didn't know the first thing about it because it wasn't any good. The earlier Godfather game is an interesting beast. I mean, the idea of a Godfather game is surely an exciting one, right? Think of the possibilities. It could have been an adventure game, or a strategy title, or something else with a bit more depth to it. After all, this is a pretty different time to the usual action flicks that got games back then. Imagine what a Godfather point-and-click game would have been like. And then look at what we actually got and be amazed at the complete lack of ambition and imagination that's on display. It is quite the achievement to take The Godfather and make it quite this tedious, although it does have some positives, ones that are perhaps obvious, and it does have some intriguing story behind it. 'Cause, well, surely this wasn't all that this time was ever going to be, right? So what went wrong? The Godfather's first game was released in late 1991 by US Gold and was initially announced by magazines a year previously. At first it was announced that US Gold had picked up rights to make a game based on the third Godfather movie, which was just out in cinemas, although it didn't quite end up working out that way. And indeed, the initial announcement wasn't just for one game. As detailed in Amiga Action's December 1990 news tidbit, US Gold intended to publish two games, one being a high-level interactive adventure game, or a point-and-click, and the other being an action game. Amiga Action really liked hyphens. Commodore Format also mentioned the game in late 1990, saying that the first of the duo was likely to come out in June for the venerable C64. US Gold double-dipping in this way wasn't uncommon at the time. They'd already done it with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, publishing both the Lucasfilm point-and-click as well as an infamously hard and frankly detestable action game made by Tiertex. You know, the one where Indy can only use his whip a few times because, I don't know, he's thrown out his shoulder or some other crap. Fellow UK software giants and frenemies Ocean also did it in 1990 with Nightbreed, releasing both the rather odd interactive movie and the rather generic action game, while US Gold would actually do it again with Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. While everyone remembers the classic adventure game, virtually nobody remembers the completely humdrum isometric action game that was made by attention to detail. In this instance, the action game was to be handled by Creative Materials, while the adventure game side of things was given to French developers Delphine Software, who already had a proven track record in this department thanks to Future Wars, Cruise for a Corpse, and Operation Stealth, which had been positioned as a James Bond tie-in game in the US, not to mention, of course, also making Eric Chahy's seminal Another World in 1991. Being that this was something of a breakthrough year for Delphine, magazines were curious to see just how the two games were going to take a narrative as complex and as epic as the Godfather saga and turn it into something playable and in any way understandable. By the middle of 1991, the license had switched slightly to be something based on all three movies rather than just part 3. Some magazines were optimistic, while others were a little sceptical. Looking at some of the previews kicking around, it is amazing how, well, thin on the ground some of them are. For example, you have a double-page spread from Zero magazine that has a few very nice-looking screenshots from the action game, but most of the article is a silly one that describes a bunch of comedy dons. Not exactly the meatiest of pieces, but well, that's what you gotta do if you've got pages in a magazine to fill and not a whole lot of info to actually fill them up with. Right up to late 1991 when the action game was finally released, Amiga Action had initially promised screenshots and details from the game as early as the start of 91, although that didn't happen, there was still word that US Gold were going to publish a Godfather adventure game by Delphine, with it getting mentions in reviews for the Creative Materials title. However, one might have worried that a year on from the initial announcement of the Birmingham boys' snaring of the licence, there was absolutely no detail on just what form the adventure game was going to take. No screenshots, no previews, no nothing. Sure enough, after the action game was released, the adventure game basically dropped out of existence in the pages of the mags, never to be mentioned again. When previews for Delphine's next game, Flashback, start to surface in the middle of 1992, no mention is made of the Godfather title they were supposed to be working on. The 1 September issue simply says that they've been quiet since the release of Another World. But then, the supposed Godfather game and Flashback were, in a somewhat twisted way, one and the same. Now, I did have a little coverage of how Flashback came from the bombed out embers of the unreleased Godfather project a few years ago when I covered the game itself, but it's worth revisiting and trying to get as much detail as possible on what the French studio was planning because, well, it is still such a wonderfully high concept idea, being both completely out there and just the sort of thing you would expect from guys like Delphine. Their idea, which they spent a good few months working on and building a demo for, was to retell the Godfather story in the future. A man, quite possibly Michael Corleone himself, would have to escape from mafia hitmen in a futuristic world where the mob still very much existed. It was a pretty far cry from the promised faithful adaptation of the trilogy's settings, it has to be said. A lot of these details come from Paul Crisset himself, leader of the project, who was interviewed in various places such as Retro Gamer and Eurogamer about Flashback in 2013, although the game's strange origins were mentioned as early as 1997 in an Edge magazine interview with Denis Mercier, one of the game's designers. Unfortunately, Crisset and Delphine ended up straying way too far from the original trappings of The Godfather for US Gold to let the game go ahead in this form. However, they did love the idea itself and what Delphine were demoing, and saw to it that it would eventually get released as Flashback, so it was hardly a complete loss. It has to be said that unless you knew of these behind-the-scenes details, you probably wouldn't recognise all that much of The Godfather in the story of Conrad B. Hart as it came out, although the game is certainly filled with plenty of cinematic stylings and references beyond that. However, with things playing out in this way, and the proposed Godfather game already delayed somewhat, US Gold were now in the position of having an action game on the go, but no proposed adventure game whatsoever. So rather than trying to salvage that with another developer, they decided to just concentrate on said action game. One imagines that the action game wasn't exactly supposed to be the main event. That would surely have been the adventure title. But US Gold decided to invest that energy and money into making Flashback a hit, which, of course, it was. Still, the Godfather action game was planned to hit plenty of platforms. The Amiga, ST, DOS, C64, Mega Drive and Master System were all going to get a version of the title, so it's not as if it was abandoned completely. However, well, much like in the case of the action game based on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the Godfather's action game was going to be found very severely wanting. Perhaps now it's time to have a proper look at this somewhat unfortunate title, concentrating on the Amiga version. When the game starts and you see the intro, you may well get pretty excited. It certainly does look appropriately epic and marvellous, and these superb graphics continue into the first stage. This is the one major highlight of the whole game, of course. The way it looks is amazing, with beautiful bitmap backgrounds that are absolutely chock full of detail and life. Every single main level is a great picture, as are all the different shooting gallery scenes. These high quality graphics may be the reason that the game came on a beastly 6 floppies, but it unquestionably gets top marks in the visual department, as it is surely one of the best looking games the Amiga had seen up to that point. The credit for all this work goes to a man named Pete Lyon. Lyon cut his teeth in the British sci-fi community of the 1970s, produced many works of art for people and conventions that he helped run, and started contributing to computer games in the mid-1980s. He didn't necessarily work on the best games, but his graphics are uniformly excellent across all of them. The likes of Airball, Astaroth and The Killing Game Show are amongst the games he worked on, alongside other licensed titles such as Fright Night and Karate Kid Part 2, as well as Amnios by Psygnosis, which he also did the game design for. So you can certainly marvel at the game's looks. It may well look like a blinder in pictures. And while there's not a whole lot of music in the game, the sound effects are pretty good as well. But playing it is, alas, a different matter. You play as an unnamed Don of the Corleone family, could be Vito, could be Michael, over 5 levels set in different locales and times, starting in New York City circa 1946, going through Las Vegas, Havana, Miami, and finishing up in 1981 Atlantic City. It's a side-scrolling shooter and little else. You walk down the street, shooting any other gangster in your path and trying to avoid hitting bystanders and cops with stray bullets. You get 2 meters, one for health and one for your standing in the family, and shooting innocents affects the latter to the point where you'll be disowned by the family if it goes down to 0. However, it does go up when you shoot gangsters. The streets are busy and mobsters move around quite a lot, meaning that not shooting civvies is a lot harder than it sounds. Although amusingly, the police don't appear to give a toss about the massive gunfight happening all around them as they plod along on their beat. The difficulty is pretty damn high. You only get 1 life for all of this, and admittedly I had to use a cheat code in order to see anything beyond the first level. A level usually ends by fighting a guy armed with a Tommy gun before you go off to a couple of little shooting gallery scenes. The one at the end of the first level, for example, takes place in a barbershop, and you give Lee's soldados the old Albert Anastasia treatment whenever they turn their chair to shoot at you. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with a game just being a side-scrolling shooter, as long as it's a well-made one. But, graphics aside, The Godfather soon runs into major issues. In the main, it is just so frickin' slow. Unfortunately, this was a game that was designed to run the same on both the Amiga and the Atari ST, and when you combine that with the quality level of the graphics, sadly this one's at an abysmal pace. It's been thoroughly kneecapped, and the level of unresponsiveness makes everything a total drudge. There's not exactly much variation either. You basically do the same thing over and over, walking right and shooting until you reach the finish. Your character can't even jump, so there's no platforming or anything. You do get some baddies who shoot at you from across the street later on, meaning that you have to shoot out of the screen to hit them, but other than that it's not long until you have exhausted this game's supply of goons. There's only one time in the game where you even go above street level, a little section of the first level where you climb up a fire escape that has the promise of being able to do that again, but it never happens. The shooting galleries also tend to play out the same every time, meaning that as much as they look nice, they also get boring pretty quickly. The only one that somewhat differs is the very last one. You have to protect Michael Corleone while a helicopter strafes around shooting every other mob boss in the room, lucky coat or not. This last scene is also, really, the only one that has any real relation to the movies, being that it's a depiction of the Atlantic City Massacre from Part 3. Which, of course, leads to another significant issue. Even more than usual for licensed tie-ins, The Godfather bears precious little relation to its source material. Now, in a lot of cases where the tie-in is for a shallower action movie or the like, that perhaps wouldn't matter too much. But for something that has as much depth and character as The Godfather does, yeah, this was a real bone of contention for reviewers at the time. Beyond that one scene at the end, there's nothing here that you'd recognise as being from any Godfather film. None of the characters, none of the locations from the movie really, just nothing at all. You could give this a more generic mob name like, I don't know, Paulie Jr. eats gabagool with the fishes or whatever, and you still probably wouldn't think that it was even ripping off The Godfather beyond being based on the activities of certain fraternal organisations. This side of things is disappointing, although I suppose one has to keep in mind that there was supposed to be a sister adventure game to go along with all of this, and that was presumably going to have all the more faithful Godfather-related goings-on and all of that. But, due to circumstances already mentioned, that didn't happen, and the action game can't carry all that weight on its own. Reviews for the game were pretty mixed, usually depending on just how much weight the critique put on those graphics. Amiga Action didn't exactly cover themselves in glory with a frankly ludicrous score of 95%, while the future bods at Format and Power were a lot harsher, scoring at 46 and 56% respectively. The more negative reviews certainly made mention of the game's beauty as well, but they couldn't look past the tedium of actually playing it. As the Amiga Power review points out, they're reviewing games, and not graphic demos. This was, alas, another example of what you usually got with creative materials. A small studio where the coders were talented, but often they had very little in the way of time or resources to complete a project. They were fixer-uppers, basically. Only a couple of people are credited with working on the nuts and bolts of this game. Tim Cannell did the version for the Amiga and ST, while Richard Applin ported that to PC-DOS. The DOS version perhaps does move a little bit better than the Amiga and ST, at the very least the frame rate is a bit more consistent, albeit consistently slow, but it's still much the same game, one that Applin himself described in one word as naff in an interview. Which, yeah, about sums it up really. And unfortunately, this was it. There were other versions of the game planned, but ultimately the game never left computer land. Almost nothing exists on a version of the game for the Mega Drive. It was only ever mentioned in a September 1991 issue of the multi-format magazine Raise, where they reported that Delphine Software were working on it. Taking this at face value, one could wonder if the Mega Drive was going to get a version of Delphine's planned adventure game, but details are so hazy here that it's difficult to tell if the mag actually got it right. The C64 version, mentioned in magazines such as Commodore Format and Games X, apparently never even got off the ground. Word was that Software Creations were going to work on this, but according to the game's entry on the almighty Games That Weren't, no work was ever started on a conversion to the C64. The mention of Software Creations is an interesting one, mind. Were they initially slated to work on the Godfather action game, full stop? Did something go wrong that then necessitated giving the project over to Creative Materials? Or did the magazine just get it wrong? Now the Master System version is where things really do get interesting. Why? Well, because in early 1993 this actually got advertised and reviewed. There's box art for it, a review from a German mag called Video Games where it gets a, well, not exactly brilliant score of 41%, and even some video footage thanks to a Dutch TV show called TROS Powerplay, who covered it in January of 1993.
Spel The Godfather, waarin Vito Corleone, zoals hij eigenlijk heet, zich schietend een weg baant door de donkere straten van de stad.
And yeah, this game looks totally different to the one we got on the Amiga. Still side-scrolling of course, but we've got jumping here, which you can't do in the Amiga game, walking on rooftops, throwing grenades, some in-game music. The folks over at SMS Power have been doing quite a lot of digging on this one. From what they've gathered, it seems that Tiertex may have been working on this, although one also wonders if it could have been Software Creations. In any case, despite seemingly being finished, going by what's available, US Gold decided to pull this at the last minute, for unknown reasons. Perhaps there's more to find here, whether it's assets from the game or even a fully fledged ROM. But as ever, these things take time and lots of gumshoe work. So good luck to the folks out there trying to get more leads on it. And well, that about does it for a very middling action game that was supposed to be one part of a much bigger and more ambitious project. It was supposed to be a Don, but it ended up being Freddo. US Gold sent it out on a boat to Lake Tahoe, told it to say a Hail Mary, and Len Neri fired a bullet into the back of its head. Laborious references aside, yeah, this isn't exactly the most memorable game in the history of the Kim Justice channel, although it does show that even the greatest and most revered movies of them all aren't safe from the clutches of the bog-standard licensed tie-in. Now when we next look at a game based on The Godfather, we will be concentrating on something that is somewhat grander in scope. But until then, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and as ever, bye for now.